The autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of Surrey, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The countryside was beginning to prepare for the long English winter, and yet inside the sprawling, ivy-covered manor of Sir Edward Hafferton, the air promised warmth, laughter, and perhaps, just beneath the surface, something altogether more sinister. Hafferton Manor had stood for centuries, its stone walls bearing witness to countless stories, both joyous and tragic. This particular weekend, the grand old house was hosting a gathering of acquaintances and relatives, an event which, though outwardly convivial, seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Sir Edward Hafferton, a man of 73 years, was the host of the affair. He was tall still, though stooped with age, with a hawk-like nose and piercing grey eyes that missed little. Though respected in his village and well regarded in the county, he was not, by any stretch of the imagination, universally beloved. His fortune, amassed through shipping and land investments, had drawn many into his orbit, and as was often the case with such men, admiration and envy walked hand in hand. As the guests arrived one by one, the house filled with the clatter of suitcases on the marble floor and the echoes of voices down the oak-panelled halls. First to arrive was Lady Margaret Ashworth, Sir Edward's widowed sister, elegant in her furs, her sharp tongue concealed only partly by a polite smile. She had lived abroad for many years and returned to England only recently, her fortune dwindled, her charm intact. Then came Dr. Lionel Carter, a family physician who had attended Sir Edward for decades. He was a man in his 60s, kindly in manner, though his eyes carried the perpetual worry of someone who had seen too many secrets within the sick rooms of England's great houses. Following him was young Charles Hafferton, Sir Edward's nephew, accompanied by his new wife, Evelyn. Charles was a man of ambition but few accomplishments, perpetually balancing on the edge of respectability and ruin. Evelyn, by contrast, exuded confidence and charm, her beauty turning heads from the moment she crossed the threshold. Other guests followed: Colonel Arthur Penrose, a retired army officer with a booming laugh and a rigid sense of honor, Miss Violet Green, a companion to Lady Margaret and an unassuming woman with observant eyes, and finally, Reverend Simon Pritchard, the village clergyman, whose gentle demeanor hid a surprisingly shrewd mind. By early evening, the house was alive with conversation, the fire in the great drawing room casting golden light upon crystal glasses and polished wood. Yet, as with many such gatherings, beneath the laughter and polite exchanges ran undercurrents of rivalry, resentment, and unspoken grievances. Sir Edward himself presided over the gathering with something between satisfaction and suspicion. He had invited them all, of course, but he trusted few. Wealth, after all, had a way of corrupting even the closest bonds. Dinner that evening was served in the great dining hall, the long oak table gleaming beneath the chandeliers. Conversation flowed freely at first, but the old man's sudden announcement turned the room cold. "I have made a decision," Sir Edward said, his voice carrying easily to every corner. He stood at the head of the table, glass of port in hand, his sharp eyes sweeping across the assembled faces. "My will is to be altered. Some of you may find the changes surprising." A hush fell across the room. Lady Margaret's lips tightened ever so slightly. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Evelyn placed a hand upon his arm as if to restrain him. The Colonel cleared his throat, the Reverend lowered his gaze, and Miss Green's eyes flickered with curiosity. Sir Edward gave a dry chuckle. "You all look so stricken. Surely you do not imagine that I intend to take my fortune with me into the grave? No, no, but I have lived long enough to know where loyalty lies and where it does not." The words lingered in the air like smoke. No one dared press him further, but the mood had shifted. The genial atmosphere was gone, replaced by something taut and uneasy. Later that night, as the guests retired to their rooms, the manor seemed to settle into a silence that was anything but peaceful. The wind outside rattled the windows, the old house creaked with age, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of footsteps echoed where no footsteps should have been. By morning, Sir Edward Hafferton would be found dead. The storm broke just after midnight. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Hafferton Manor, and the wind howled across the moors like a wounded creature. Inside, the house was plunged into uneasy stillness, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the drawing room that had been left to burn low. In the corridors above, the guests lay in their rooms, though not all slept. Lady Margaret tossed restlessly, plagued by thoughts of her brother's announcement. Charles and Evelyn argued in hushed tones behind closed doors, their voices sharp, though indistinct. Colonel Penrose, ever punctual even in retirement, had retired early but lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his military mind considering every word of Sir Edward's speech. And in the great master's suite at the end of the hall, Sir Edward Hafferton himself sat at his writing desk, pen scratching across thick parchment. The flickering candle cast a long shadow of his gaunt figure against the wall. He muttered as he wrote, as though arguing with himself or with the ghosts of his past. At 1:30, a sound broke through the storm. A muffled thud, followed by the faintest cry, quickly stifled. Then silence. It was not until morning that the truth came to light. The maid, Alice, was the first to discover it. She entered Sir Edward's chamber at precisely 8 o'clock, as she had been instructed for years. Carrying a tray with his morning tea, she knocked gently on the door. No answer. She knocked again, then pushed the door open. The tray clattered to the floor. Sir Edward lay slumped over his desk, his pen fallen from his hand, the parchment beneath him soaked with spilled ink and something darker. A deep wound marked his temple, the handle of a heavy brass candlestick lying nearby, smeared with blood. His grey eyes were open, staring unseeing at the room around him. Alice screamed, the sound echoing through the house. Within moments, the guests and staff were gathered outside the chamber, faces pale, voices rising in panic. Dr. Carter pushed through the crowd, his bag already in hand. He bent over the lifeless figure, his brow furrowed. After a moment, he shook his head gravely. There is nothing to be done. He is gone. Gasps and murmurs filled the hall. Evelyn clutched Charles's arm dramatically, her eyes darting toward the candlestick on the floor. Lady Margaret pressed a handkerchief to her lips, though her expression was more calculating than grief-stricken. Colonel Penrose muttered something under his breath about damned cowardice while the Reverend closed his eyes in silent prayer. The butler, Mr. Hargreaves, stood stiffly at the door, his face ashen but composed. "We must call the authorities at once," he said firmly. "Yes," Dr. Carter agreed, rising slowly. "But make no mistake, this was no accident. Sir Edward Hafferton was murdered." The words fell like a stone into water, sending ripples through every heart present. 2 hours later, Inspector James Whitfield of the Surrey Constabulary arrived at the manor. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm, deliberate manner. He had seen his share of tragedies, yet the air of this grand old house struck him as particularly heavy, as though it bore witness to something long in the making. He was met in the drawing-room by the assembled guests. They sat in silence, the fire burning brightly as though to mock the gloom that had settled upon them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitfield began, his voice steady but commanding, "I must ask for your cooperation. Sir Edward's death is under investigation, and until further notice, no one is to leave the house." At this, Evelyn gave a little gasp, clutching her pearls. Charles frowned, his jaw tightening. Lady Margaret raised one brow, though said nothing. The inspector continued. "Dr. Carter has confirmed the cause of death, a single blow to the head, delivered by the candlestick found at the scene. It appears Sir Edward was attacked while working at his desk sometime during the night. There are no signs of forced entry. Which means he let his gaze sweep across the room that the killer is among us." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Colonel Penrose broke it at last, his voice booming. "Then we had better find the scoundrel quickly, Inspector, for there is nothing more foul than murder under one's own roof." Whitfield gave a small nod. "Rest assured, Colonel, we shall. But I must begin at once by questioning each of you in turn. Until then, I ask that you remain calm and truthful. Lies will serve no one here." Miss Violet Green shifted in her chair, her quiet eyes flicking from one guest to another. The Reverend clasped his hands together tightly, as though in prayer, though his gaze was fixed on the inspector. Whitfield looked around once more, his expression unreadable. "I will uncover the truth," he said simply. "For secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, have a way of rising to the surface." And with that, the interviews began. Inspector James Whitfield preferred to work methodically. He was not a man of sudden leaps of intuition, nor did he enjoy theatrics. Instead, he believed in patience, in letting people reveal themselves through small slips of tongue, stray glances, or inconsistencies that, once noticed, could unravel the tightest knot. He began his questioning in the library, a room lined with dark oak shelves and the faint scent of leather and pipe smoke. The fire had been lit, casting a warm glow over the room, though the atmosphere was anything but comfortable. First, Lady Margaret Ashworth. She entered gracefully, her chin tilted ever so slightly upward, as though determined not to appear cowed by the inspector. She wore black silk despite the morning hour, her pearl necklace gleaming in the firelight. "Lady Margaret," Whitfield began, gesturing toward the chair opposite his desk, "I appreciate your cooperation." "Of course," she replied smoothly, seating herself. "Though I must say, Inspector, the entire business is deeply distasteful. My brother gone, and his house turned into an interrogation chamber." Whitfield's pen scratched across his notebook. "When did you last see Sir Edward alive?" "After dinner," she said. "We all retired not long after his unfortunate announcement." Her lips thinned at the memory. "You seemed troubled by it?" Her eyes flickered. What family member wouldn't he be troubled by talk of Will's? Edward was a difficult man, Inspector. Brilliant in his way, but stubborn and suspicious. Still, he was my brother. I should not like the world to think me heartless." Whitfield let the silence linger until she shifted slightly in her chair. "Did you leave your room last night?" She hesitated. "No." His eyes narrowed. "You hesitated, Lady Margaret." A smile touched her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "I heard footsteps in the corridor. It unsettled me, but I did not rise to investigate. At my age, Inspector, one clings to comfort more than curiosity." Next, Charles Hafferton. He arrived with Evelyn by his side, though Whitfield quickly instructed that she would be interviewed separately. Charles sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. "Your uncle's announcement must have been a shock," Whitfield began. Charles gave a bitter laugh. Shock, it was a death sentence for half the people in that dining hall. My uncle liked to toy with us, Inspector. He enjoyed watching us squirm. And you? I had no reason to kill him. His voice was sharp, defensive. On the contrary, Whitfield said mildly, you may have had the strongest reason. You and your wife have financial difficulties, do you not? Charles's face reddened. That's none of your business. Everything concerning last night is my business. Did you leave your room? Charles stopped, glanced toward the door where Evelyn had departed, then muttered, yes. For a few minutes. I couldn't sleep. I went down to fetch a drink from the decanter in the drawing room. Did you see anyone? No, Charles said quickly. The corridors were empty. Whitfield made a note. Too quick. Then, Evelyn Hafferton. She swept in like a stage actress entering her scene, head held high, eyes bright, lips curved in a faint smile. Inspector, she said with perfect poise, I do hope we can put this dreadful matter behind us soon. The strain is unbearable. Whitfield regarded her coolly. Your husband admits he left your room last night. Did you? Charles is restless by nature, she said smoothly. I remained in bed. And yet the maid reported seeing your bedroom lamp still burning after 2 o'clock. For a moment, Evelyn's composure cracked, but only slightly. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Very well, Inspector. I will tell you what I did not wish my husband to know. I did rise in the night, but only to walk in the corridor. I needed air. I felt suffocated. Did you go to your uncle-in-law's room? Her eyes flashed. Certainly not. Do you think me capable of murder? Whitfield did not answer. He simply wrote another line in his notebook. Colonel Penrose was next. He strode in briskly, heels clicking against the floor, shoulders squared like a man still in uniform. He sat without invitation, glaring at the inspector as though daring him to suggest dishonor. I'll tell you this, Whitfield, the colonel said in his booming voice, I did not kill Sir Edward. The man may have been a cantankerous old devil, but I served alongside braver men than I care to count, and I would not sully my honor with a coward's blow in the night. Whitfield nodded. And yet, Colonel, honor does not shield one from suspicion. Where were you after retiring? In my room. Wide awake. Listening to that blasted storm. And I'll add this, I heard movement around 1 o'clock. Footsteps in the corridor, more than one set, I'd wager. Did you recognize them? No. But I know discipline when I hear it. One pair moved quickly, light-footed, like someone who didn't want to be heard. The other was heavier, slower. That piece of information Whitfield underlined twice. Miss Violet Green entered quietly. She was unassuming, with her plain dress and timid manner, but her eyes were sharp, watchful. You served as Lady Margaret's companion, Whitfield said. What was your impression of Sir Edward? He frightened me, she admitted softly. Not by words, but by presence. He had a way of looking at one, as though measuring one's worth in silence. And last night? I heard voices, she whispered. Raised voices. From Sir Edward's study. But when I opened my door, the corridor was empty. Whose voices? She hesitated. A man's and a woman's angry. I could not distinguish more. Finally, Reverend Pritchard. The clergyman entered with folded hands, his expression solemn. He took his seat and met Whitfield's gaze without flinching. "I must confess, Inspector," he said quietly, "I fear Sir Edward had made enemies even within these walls." His announcement stirred resentment in every heart. "Did it stir yours?" Pritchard's eyes narrowed. "I am but a servant of God. My place is not in inheritance. Yet." He paused. "I did leave my room briefly, to pray in the chapel downstairs. I could not rest. On my way, I thought I saw a shadow slip into the master's corridor. It was too dark to say who." "Conveniently vague," Whitfield remarked. The Reverend did not rise to the bait. He simply lowered his head, murmuring a quiet verse under his breath. Dash dash. When the questioning ended, Whitfield closed his notebook and stood by the fire, staring into the flames. Each guest had motive. Each had opportunity. And each had lied or at least withheld something. The house felt alive with secrets. Somewhere among these men and women was a murderer. But who? The following evening, Inspector Whitfield summoned everyone to the great drawing room. The storm had passed, but the house still seemed heavy with unease. Guests gathered reluctantly, faces pale, eyes darting toward one another with suspicion and dread. The fire blazed in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Whitfield stood near the mantel, his notebook in hand, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have listened to your accounts, and I have studied the scene of the crime. Each of you had motive, each had opportunity. But only one among you struck the fatal blow. No one spoke. The silence was electric. Dash dash. The inspector's reconstruction. At 1:30, Sir Edward was still alive, writing at his desk. He had recently announced changes to his will, changes that would disinherit some, reward others, and alter the balance of this family. That announcement created fear, resentment, and desperation. He turned toward Lady Margaret. "You resented the loss of your comfortable future. You admitted hearing footsteps but claimed you stayed in your room. I believe you lied, you feared being seen in the corridor. Still, you were not the one who held the candlestick." Lady Margaret's lips tightened, but she said nothing. "Charles Hafferton," Whitfield continued, "you were nearly ruined. Your uncle's fortune was your lifeline. You admit leaving your room, but you insist you saw no one. I believe you were not alone in that corridor." Charles's face flushed crimson. Evelyn shifted uneasily beside him. "And you, Mrs. Hafferton," the inspector said, his gaze sharp, "you claimed restlessness drove you to walk. Yet your lamp burned past 2 o'clock, and Miss Green heard raised voices from Sir Edward's study. Voices of a man and a woman. Yours, Mrs. Hafferton, and your husband's." Evelyn gasped. "That is a lie." "On the contrary," Whitfield said evenly, "it explains everything. You and Charles confronted Sir Edward, perhaps to plead, perhaps to threaten. He refused. Tempers flared. But here lies the crucial point, the blow that killed him was struck not by Charles but by you, Evelyn." The room erupted with gasps. Charles leapt to his feet. "That's impossible. She would never." Whitfield raised a hand. The wound was on the right side of Sir Edward's head. To deliver such a blow, the killer must have stood behind him and been left-handed. Charles is right-handed. Evelyn, however. He looked directly at her. "You are left-handed. Your handwriting in the guest register proves it." Evelyn's composure shattered. Her face drained of color, her hand clutching the arm of the chair as though to steady herself. "It was an accident," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He goaded us, mocked us, said he would leave everything to some charity, that we would be beggars within a year. Charles argued with him, but I could not bear his sneer. I reached for the candlestick. I only meant to frighten him." Charles collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands. The inspector's voice was steady. "Yet you struck with such force that death was instantaneous. That, Mrs. Hafferton, is no accident. Dash dash. The aftermath." Silence filled the room, broken only by Evelyn's ragged breath. Lady Margaret stared at her niece-in-law with a mixture of horror and triumph. Colonel Penrose muttered a curse beneath his breath. Reverend Pritchard bowed his head as though in sorrowful prayer. Whitfield closed his notebook. "Mrs. Evelyn Hafferton, you are under arrest for the murder of Sir Edward Hafferton." Two constables, who had been waiting in the corridor, stepped forward. Evelyn did not resist as they led her away, though her eyes darted once toward Charles, a look of anger, of betrayal, of something that would haunt him forever. As the door closed behind her, the room seemed to exhale, the tension lifting at last. But for those who remained, life at Hafferton Manor would never be the same. Inspector Whitfield stood by the fire a moment longer, gazing into the flames. Another case closed, another truth dragged into the light. And outside, the autumn wind swept across the countryside once more, carrying with it the whispers of secrets too heavy to keep.